I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. If you've heard the letters PJM, that's short for PJM Interconnection, the country's largest regional electricity transmission organization that covers Maryland and 12 other states from New Jersey to Illinois and Michigan to North Carolina and the District of Columbia. PJM is currently at the center of criticism as electricity bills rise and are expected to continue to rise for the foreseeable future. Everything costs more. But if egg prices are high due to the avian flu, what specifically ails the power market? Maryland's Democratic legislators, such as Lorik Cherkudian, who was on this podcast, has put the blame on PJM for failing to adequately plan for either the coming demand due to electrification and data center growth or the coming retirement of fossil fuel generators that has affected supply. The market failure has sent future wholesale prices of electricity soaring. I invited Jason Stanek, PJM's executive director for government relations, and it turns out the past chair of Maryland's Public Service Commission, to explain what's going on from his point of view. Stay with us.
I Hate Politics is brought to you by UMBC's Political Science Program, where you'll learn to shape public policy, impact communities, and function at the center of modern society. Learn more at shadygrove.umbc.edu.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning, especially when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Cat Scan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C. Paul Chaperas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album, reflecting the time and this cultural moment, is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. Jason Stanek, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
With rising energy costs, how does PJM take into account the interests of ratepayers? What is the mechanism for that?
So PJM operates the bulk power system, and we operate effectively the power grid in 13 states and the District of Columbia. Our main mission is to preserve reliability 24/7 on the grid. But we also operate competitive markets, and the goal of the competitive markets is to provide the commodity effectively at least costs, so customers effectively receive the best deal for their power supplies. We care about affordability, and that's a consideration at PJM. But at the end of the day, maintaining grid reliability is job number one for us. All of these processes are supervised by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who is our sole regulator. They have a just and reasonable standard when they review any actions that PJM takes. And we have stakeholders. We have over 1,100 members who participate in our processes, including government agencies such as the Maryland Office of People's Counsel, who is the ratepayer advocate for the state of Maryland.
Of the 1,100 members, how many are consumer advocates?
We have consumer advocate representation from all 14 of our jurisdictions. So you would have 14 there. The other members are split into other groups, including utilities, transmission operators, generators, other suppliers. So we have a really broad base of membership at the organization.
The generators and the utilities make up 1,086 members, and the consumer advocates make up 14 members.
In terms of raw numbers, that's correct. But we have sector-weighted voting, and we have a special relationship with our state ratepayer advocates. They get together under a group called CAPS, which is the consumer advocates of the PJM states. We're in frequent contact to them. So when there's a vote, it's not as similar to a vote in Congress where just one vote is equally weighted.
Normally, one would expect, as any voting is, that 1,086 people vote one way and 14 people vote the other way. This is not even a contest, right? But you're saying that you somehow boost the 14 for it to be more meaningful. What is that?
Well, it's not necessarily a boost. There are obviously tensions when you take a look at PJM with the 13 states. We have states that continue to support their thermal and fossil resources, and we also have states with very clean energy, aggressive clean energy goals, such as Maryland, New Jersey, and Delaware. Oftentimes, these need to be reconciled, and currently, we're attempting to reconcile a new federal rule called FERC Order Number 1920 with respect to long-term transmission planning and cost allocation. So the states oftentimes get together in order to reconcile their varying policies, because the policies of the state of West Virginia are somewhat different than the policies of Maryland. So we work.
That's correct. And so it really is a question of this reconciliation is so important. So how do you reconcile that?
We meet with states almost weekly to reconcile both individually and collectively in order to figure out, can the 13 states plus the District of Columbia reach some type of compromise on their own? Or at PJM, do we need to help influence that? But at the end of the day—
But how would you influence that?
Just working with the legislators, working with the policymakers and the regulators.
So it's outside of the voting framework, right? So my question is, how are consumer rights protected in the system that you run? And it seems that within the voting system, there isn't a direct way.
No, I would agree with you. There's not a direct way within the voting system.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about demand. It's been a big thing that demand is going up. We understand why demand is going up: data centers and electrification.
As expected, they have gone up considerably. Our long-term load forecast is now up to about 220 gigawatts by 2040. The 220 gigawatt estimate reflects our summer peak. We're expecting somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3% year over year increase.
In a market, there's going to be some people that sell and some people that buy. Given that it is a market, why is it important for every state to be self-sufficient? You have made the argument that in-state generation should increase. How do you reconcile those two?
Over-reliance could be detrimental to a particular jurisdiction. For instance, we're well aware that Maryland, on average, imports about 40% of its electricity needs on an annual basis from other states.
Can any state in the 13-state market called PJM say that I have the first right of refusal on in-state generation? Is that a allowed position within the PJM governance?
The physics of the system, as you know, electrons travel in the path of least resistance, and they don't know where the state boundaries are. There's only so much we at PJM could do to actually control the movement of electrons on the network.
Which is to say, not at all.
Not at all. But we have heard from some states, such as West Virginia, who is a net energy exporter, question, why are we sending our electrons out of state?
Is that even a possibility? Will you allow it?
We don't enforce the laws. We comply with the tariff that's approved by the federal government. But I believe that there could be fashioned some type of a state policy that is intended to keep their electrons within the state.
Is there any state in the 13-state consortium that has done this, ever done this, is considering doing this?
I'm not aware that this has ever occurred.
Would such a rule be upheld by FERC, or would that be a violation of the market itself?
That is a good question. Something for FERC to consider, whether that would be an impingement on interstate activity, interstate commerce of the electric commodity. I don't think we've reached that point yet. Up until now, we've had sufficient generating capacity, and with these tight conditions, we're beginning to hear some of these arguments for the first time.
What is your confidence level in the demand projections you are making? I'm asking because, obviously, if you're a data center, you're looking at multiple jurisdictions at the same time. And so the utilities in those jurisdictions are being approached. They are being given papers saying we are thinking about this, but they'll only go to one place. They won't go to three different locations that are under consideration. Can you reconcile those kinds of duplications within the projection calculations, or is that just impossible?
So we continually refine the forecasts. We're working with our local distribution utilities on the ground. They are closest to their customers. They know their service territory, and they feed that information back to PJM on an annual basis, allowing us to create this new load forecast every January.
That's right, but there is no reconciliation across those utilities.
The reconciliation would occur at PJM as we're taking a look at.
How would you do it?
Admittedly, I'm not an expert in sort of the load forecast department, but as they're getting information from, let's say, PEPCO and BGE, which are both Exelon utilities, we would have methods to effectively determine, okay, are we looking at the same numbers? Is this 888 megawatt load the same as the 880 megawatt load in an adjacent jurisdiction?
There were two ways to meet demand. One, to generate, or to import. And in order to import, you need transmission lines. I believe at the General Assembly, you said that transmission projects come to die in Maryland. Why is that?
Maryland's a relatively small state. Most of its population lives along the I-95 corridor, where we have one transmission line, high voltage transmission line, currently constructed many decades ago. It's very difficult to develop energy infrastructure in the state, whether it be new generation resources or new transmission resources. As a former state regulator, I can tell you that it was difficult to build new batteries, build natural gas, build transmission lines. There's sufficient community opposition. The CPCN, which is the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity regulations, effectively the permitting regulations, require approvals at various levels. Of course, the counties in the state of Maryland are very powerful. And then you need official approval from the state as well. So if a project takes 10, 15 plus years to develop, developers may decide that they will invest their dollars in other states where they could earn a return rather than be exposed to some degree of uncertainty in the state of Maryland.
You were the chair of the Public Services Commission in Maryland for a number of years in the last 10 years. At least last 5 of those, we've known the demand's kind of picking up. You were appointed by a Republican governor. Governor Hogan ran the state for 2 terms during that time. You talked about the certificate of convenience. Those can be issued by the Public Services Commission. You could have issued it against the wishes of a county, but you didn't. Why?
I would disagree with that premise there. We issued While I was at the Public Service Commission, literally hundreds of CPCN applications, mostly for solar, but also approved new CPCNs for high voltage transmission lines. Unfortunately, while I was at the commission, we weren't able to actually site and develop 1 inch of new transmission. There was substantial litigation where these lines crossed at the state border in Pennsylvania, which prevented that.
But the litigation is in Pennsylvania. It's not in Maryland, is it?
That's correct. Maryland approved the transmission line, and that litigation is ongoing.
Correct. So how is it that transmission projects come to Maryland to die when the lawsuit is in Pennsylvania?
Well, that's one example. There are many other examples of high voltage transmission lines that were proposed in the state that did not go forward, including lines with names such as Trail and Path and Map. These were all large, relatively expensive transmission lines that did not get built over the past 2 decades.
But isn't that the responsibility of the Public Services Commission in Maryland to do, and you were the chair at that time?
It's the responsibility of the PSC to effectively run and provide oversight to this CPCM process, which allows due process for all the parties involved, including local landowners, citizens, state agencies. And before the PSC, the PSC hears all of these concerns. They also look at the need. Do we need this project in a time frame to meet whatever demand is coming onto the system, whether it be generation, need for
Sure, I do understand that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but what I want to know is that you have said that transmission projects, generation projects, perhaps, I think you might include them too, die in Maryland. And you were the chair of the Public Services Commission. Governor Hogan was the governor at that time. You saw this, and it's under your watch that these projects died.
I would say that the projects that came before the PSC, for the most part, were approved. Developers oftentimes did not go forward after receiving the PSC approval, or there were effectively situations outside of the state's control, such as the Pennsylvania litigation, which killed some of these projects.
Is there any state in the 13-state consortium that is PJM where it is easy to build transmission or generation?
It is not easy to build energy infrastructure in this day and age across any of our states. Some states, such as Ohio, have a much more robust transmission system to the extent you have more areas of undeveloped land with less people living near the rights of way. You could build transmission quicker. To the extent you have more certainty in your CPCN permitting processes, if there are particular deadlines, that provides the infrastructure developer with at least some guarantee that they'll have a decision, either yes or no, within a prescribed time frame. In Maryland, there is no time frame, so the process could drag on for an indeterminate amount of time. And that level of uncertainty is concerning to those who are putting up the dollars to build these projects.
Is the contrast to Maryland only Ohio, or is there another state that has limits on permits?
Pennsylvania has had a history of being able to build generation in a relatively timely manner. But we're seeing concerns now across our states. Obviously, I think social media plays a big part in allowing grassroots communities to form relatively quickly, provide that opposition. We're seeing in the state of Virginia now, it's getting very difficult to build new transmission as well.
So then can you really isolate and say projects come to Maryland to die?
There may be a little hyperbole there, but in comparison to other states, Maryland hasn't built any substantial transmission lines in literally decades, whereas I could point to new transmission lines in Virginia. I could point to New Jersey, where they have a plan to build offshore transmission to get their wind onshore. Maryland, we have 1 or 2 high voltage transmission lines currently planned. One of them is the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project that's been getting a lot of opposition against the developer and PJM for approving the project.
The argument that I've heard from those that oppose the Piedmont Reliability Project is that their land is being taken and Maryland ratepayers have to bear the cost, in part, of building this huge project when really it's Virginia that needs all the power. I assume this is not a new problem. I assume this is a problem across any state boundary. Whenever a major project like this comes up anywhere, that you will get opposition. I'm asking why that opposition in Maryland is unique, that you are able to identify that as, something that the other 12, 13 members don't do.
I would argue that at least in present day, this project is unique in respect to the opposition that we're seeing, because PJM has approved substantial amounts of transmission across the footprint. This Piedmont project has run into more opposition than we've seen with respect to other projects.
Is it a better model to building transmission lines? Because the states and counties don't really have an authority to act in this matter. If the PSC decides, if FERC decides, if PJM decides, you can do it.
That's correct. The PSC has exclusive jurisdiction and effectively the final say into whether or not this line gets constructed. To your question, is there a better way? I think providing more certainty and early upfront consultation with affected communities goes a long way to either reducing opposition or providing additional education that allows people to understand, why is this transmission line being built. In the instance of the Piedmont project, we've heard this is just an extension cord to go between Pennsylvania and Virginia. And that's effectively not true. There will be benefits to the state of Maryland and satisfy needs that are not currently being met.
You can see why people may say that, right? There are 14 consumer advocates in your membership and 1,086 generators, utilities, transmission owners. That's the imbalance that leads people to think that those who hold the votes get to determine all of this.
Well, the approval of these transmission projects are not subject to a vote. They're not up for debate. Ultimately, our independent board of directors is the authority that says go forth or don't go forth with an application at PJM. And then you have an independent federal agency at FERC make that final determination whether or not the approval of these projects is just and reasonable, not unduly discriminatory, and in the public interest.
So you know what is striking about what you just said? Is that on the one hand, the authorities are all there. On the other hand, we are being told that you can't build because of local opposition. How is both of those things true? Either you have the authority and exercise it, or locals get a say. It's not like there is a mechanism for locals to have a real say, except in the public.
Having served as a regulator on similar energy infrastructure projects, I can tell you that the commission listens to the public to the extent that we all work together, the regulator, the developer, the landowner. There are ways to either mitigate, satisfy, or ultimately settle some of these concerns without having to go to litigation at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or in many cases, if they don't like the decision at FERC, they could appeal that to the federal courts.
Who is ultimately responsible for what is called resource adequacy planning?
We have the authority and the responsibility to maintain resource adequacy on the system.
To the extent that resource adequacy planning has not met its goal, the responsibility lies with PJM.
That's correct.
What is your analysis for why PJM has failed resource adequacy?
I don't think we've failed resource adequacy.
Based on how you have spoken about this, there seems to be some sort of crisis. Why did we get to this crisis? If you want to solve the crisis, you have to understand why you got here. What is it that brought you here?
Well, effectively, in just a few words, we've seen an unprecedented supply and demand imbalance on the horizon, and it's coming quicker than we actually expected.
So your projections were bad?
I think that our projections were off compared to what we're seeing now.
Why were your projections off?
I don't think anybody could be faulted for not expecting the large load increases. 24 months ago, nobody was talking about data center development and the forecast and the resurgence of economic development in this country to the magnitude that we're seeing now. Of course, the transmission planning, which is core to our function, that continues to change. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued a landmark ruling last May, which is substantially changing the way in which we conduct transmission planning over a 20-year period.
What is that change?
The cost allocation, which is the concern over who ultimately pays, has been an issue of particular concern. You have states with clean energy policies, and you have states that don't necessarily want to pay for these relatively expensive transmission buildouts. So effectively, under this new policy, the federal government has stated that if a state benefits from a clean energy project, transmission to supplement offshore wind, and that policy is not the policy of a state that doesn't necessarily support offshore wind, the federal government effectively says, if you are going to benefit, you will still have to pay for that. Some of these cost allocation rules, which have been hotly contested over the past several years, have now been finalized.
We talk about demand a lot, but there's also the huge part of supply. Now, in terms of supply, we have known now for 10, 15 years that the coal plants are going to be closed at some point. When it is, we don't know. But you had a rule that said a coal plant need only tell you about this 3 months ahead. And that's the window that you have to work with. When in fact, the market conditions were clear 10 years ago that they have to be closed. So why is PJM following a rule that doesn't work when you could have asked for a new rule, passed, your independent board could have passed it, you could have gone to FERC and changed it 10 years ago, and now suddenly we have a problem?
That's a fair point. We do have a 90-day notice requirement for a generator to depart on the system. And that's a consideration that PJM will look at, whether or not we need a longer time frame in which to provide notice. But the supply dynamics right now are changing dramatically. After this unit, I think you're referring to the Brandon Shores unit, retires, we'll effectively have no coal generation left in the state of Maryland. And what will it be replaced with? Most of this queue that we call interconnection queue is populated by solar predominantly, battery storage, and wind projects. And we've not seen those projects come online as fast as we would have had hoped for. But with some reforms that we made to the queue back in 2022, we're beginning to see some of the fruits of that work materialize.
You did promise that this queue that you have that's been building up for several years will be cleared within a year or two.
That's right.
I still don't understand why that queue built up in the first place. And if you look at renewable penetration in the various RTOs, the regional transmission organizations, PGA is at the bottom, that you have not allowed renewables to be interconnected at the same pace as perhaps the other RTOs. Why would that be?
Well, I would disagree with that.
Which part would you disagree with?
Well, there are other RTOs with queues that are larger, and all the queues look similar in terms of...
But their penetration is higher. So with respect to how much renewable penetration there is, PJM is dead last.
Well, we don't develop the projects. We don't own the projects. We will take whatever watts are generated, whether they be from solar, wind, battery, coal, natural gas, or oil units. The fact that some resources are coming online quicker, I really don't have a good answer for you as to. So,
but you are responsible for resource adequacy planning, so you have to understand that.
So over the course of a couple of years, we did identify that the queue was effectively doubling in terms of number of applications from about 2018 to 2021. Why did the queue effectively expand so quickly? I would say it was largely due to policies, right? Policies at the state level, policies at the federal level.
Such as?
The Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan...
What did the Inflation Reduction Act do that increased your queue?
Well, promoted development of clean energy in terms of policies, in terms of...
Oh, I see. So you were saying that the promotion of clean energy is what is causing the queue to increase. But you could have a rule that allowed clean energy to move faster through the queue, and problem solved.
And that's what we've been doing. But when you see the queue for many years, we had 300-400 projects in the queue, and then all of a sudden we hit a high watermark of over 1,300 projects in the queue in 2021. We did not waste any time to work with our members and to go immediately to FERC, who approved a package of reforms that we have since implemented. And we're seeing that we're moving these projects through. And as noted, they're mostly solar projects, followed quickly by battery and wind projects. Now there's a challenge though. We've already cleared 50 gigawatts of resources with all the necessary PJM approvals. And if you recall, currently our peak demand on the system is about 180 gigawatts. So 50 gigawatts is a considerable amount, but they're not getting built. And why is that? And then we look back to some of the causes, and the causes are financing of the projects. The causes are supply chains and the ability to actually get, whether it be the solar panels or the wind turbines. But the number one reason we're hearing from our developers who have exited the queue and why aren't you getting built is the fact that permitting at the state level has got them tied up in knots.
But permitting in Maryland was literally under your control as the chair of the Public Services Commission.
That's correct. And we moved a tremendous amount of permitting applications.
So it's not permitting then. If you moved a tremendous number of applications, then it's not permitting that is holding it up.
Yes and no. I mean, the permits can be in place, but since COVID, post-COVID, we've seen some more challenges, despite the fact that the Supreme Court of Maryland has ruled that the Maryland PSC has exclusive authority to grant these permits. There's been litigation challenges by the Maryland counties that have challenged that authority, and they figured out ways to effectively impose effective de facto moratoriums.
What's an example?
I believe Dorchester County has effectively has a moratorium now on onshore wind turbines. I believe Carroll County is another county that has passed.
How much is wind in Maryland's generation?
Very small.
Exactly. It's irrelevant. I mean, the Dorchester ban on wind onshore wind turbines is irrelevant.
Well, you have to. I would argue that you would have to start somewhere in terms of building the renewables. Nobody wants a solar array in their backyard, or at least most people don't. Same thing with batteries or wind turbines. So we have to figure out. And I'm glad to see that this year, the General Assembly in Annapolis, they're considering a whole suite of legislative proposals.
PJM did a report called Flexibility for the Future, where you identified that 93% of supply would need to be carbon-free based on state policies across your entire 14-state grid. How are you preparing for that then?
We're in a period of transition right now. Is technology, is development keeping up with this pace of change? Or will some states need to come to the recognition and realization we might not be able to hit these aggressive 2030, 2040 clean energy and decarbonization goals. And we have one proposal that we're expecting a determination from for very, very soon to effectively allow some shovel-ready generation projects to advance in the queue faster than would have otherwise been permitted. And we're hopeful that that will connect new resources, both in Maryland and across the jurisdiction. There are a number of bills. Some may restrict permitting, but some may advance permitting. There's one bill that effectively sets time limitations on the Public Service Commission to move forward through their CPCN process.
Is there any plan to include states much more formally in the resource adequacy planning process?
Well, some states do resource planning, for instance, for Virginia. Other states don't.
Is this an issue of deregulation and vertical integrated systems? What is the difference?
You nailed it on the head. In PJM, we have two types of states. We have states that are vertically integrated, which means that their utility actually owns the power generation, which is delivered through the distribution lines to your home. So it's one-stop shopping. Whereas in other states, such as Maryland, such as Pennsylvania, these are restructured states. Some may refer to them as deregulated states, but I could assure you that they are still fully regulated. So these restructured states rely on the markets for resource adequacy to attract sufficient generation to their state. So they operate in a competitive market, and they rely on PJM to provide those needs. And this occurred, restructuring in Maryland occurred back in 1999. At that time, Maryland had integrated resource planning department at the Public Service Commission, but that department has since been disbanded with the advent of these competitive markets. There is an open question now, and I know there's a bill that was introduced by Senator Hester and Vice Chairman Crosby that is looking at whether or not the state does need a resource planner within the Public Service Commission. And will they supplement PJM? I don't know. That bill is currently under review. But I don't think it's a bad idea to have effectively a planner in state to determine, is Maryland meeting its needs? And we know right now that the state imports a tremendous amount of energy. Is there a pathway for self-sufficiency?
But self-sufficiency as a standard in a market is just a ridiculous standard.
40% requires an over-reliance on your neighbors around the clock.
If 40% is over-reliant, what is the level of importation that you would say, well, this is not over-reliant, this is the market operating?
You could be at 0%, but that assumes that there's free entry, there's sufficient capacity on the system, there's not policy interference. Obviously, Maryland has very aggressive clean energy policies. If they if they didn't care about clean energy, and we had sufficient capacity, you could dispatch with all generation in the state and bring it down to zero, and then you could have sort of the free flow of electrons created in other states. So I agree with you there. It's not a market failure to be at 40% net imports, but with other factors that either burden or challenge the ability of the state to get those imports is a question that we're struggling with right now.
Jason Stanek, thank you for taking the time to explain PJM.
Thank you. It was good to be here.
Normally, at this time, we draw lessons from my conversation with my guest, but Jason Stanek, PJM's Executive Director for Government Relations and former chair of Maryland's Public Service Commission, has himself been revelatory on several counts, from PJM's governance model to the reasons for why renewables are not coming online fast enough to stabilize electricity prices. So instead of drawing lessons, here is a news update. Since I interviewed Stanek, the Democratic leadership in the Maryland General Assembly seems to have heard his criticism about the state's permitting woes and has introduced a bill to facilitate new natural gas-powered generating plants to be built in the state. which will both likely stabilize electricity rates and set back the state's emission control goals. The state's leading environmental groups, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, Maryland Sierra Club, and the election voters have stood up to oppose the bill. Here is what Mike Tidwell of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network said.
I'm Mike Tidwell, director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. Most Maryland voters will be shocked to learn that some lawmakers in Annapolis are considering a policy that could build a large gas-fired power plant or two in the state. Data shows gas, as Carlos said, is actually more expensive than modern battery storage as a way to address the state's rising use of electricity. And in an era of rapid global warming, with wildfires in California and flooding in downtown Annapolis, the last thing Maryland should be doing is building a new gas plant. Such plants using methane from fracked wells across the region would contribute to global warming as much or more than coal plants when you factor in the life cycle emissions from leakage and combustion. It's being discussed that 3 gigawatts of new gas could be built in the state, equal to all the coal and oil-fired plants slated for retirement in our state. 3 gigawatts, if you just take readily available estimates from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, that could cost between $3 and $4 billion to build. And we have not seen any independent modeling or independent data from proponents of a gas plant that would show that this $3 to $4 billion would actually be cheaper than investing in battery storage, energy efficiency, and solar. Then, as some have said, would consider supporting a gas plant if it came with carbon capture and storage. That's expensive as well. And estimates are that that could be as much as $350 million per year added to the cost of the plant. That's because at $150 a ton, which is the common estimate for carbon capture, you have to capture the carbon, you have to put it in a pipe, you have to send it as far away as Western Maryland, and then put it underground where you hope that some subterranean cavern will permanently be sealed and prevent leakage. There's also something called the social cost of carbon that is a very common number that has been used by previous presidential administrations. Under the Biden administration, the EPA estimated that a ton of carbon imposes about $190 per ton of impacts on society, from health to climate change, et cetera. So if you added that, the social cost of carbon, even if you don't capture the carbon, the social cost of carbon, even of just a part-time peaker plant, would be about $450 million per year to run those plants. So look, we support a lot of bills and a lot that the Maryland General Assembly has done. This state house has done as much as any state house in the country to fight climate change, from renewable portfolio standard to the Clean Energy Jobs Act. And there are lots of great bills before the General Assembly this year. Solar siting bill, Senator Feldman and Chairman C.T. Wilson, an energy planning bill with Senator Hester and Delegate Crosby, the Abundant Advanced Clean Energy Act from Laura Charkoudian. There's so many great ideas, so many great policies that we can embrace in this state instead of building gas plants.
That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. Don't forget to tune in to our Tuesday morning news analysis. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from CatScan, an art pop rock band from Washington, D.C., Paul Chaparas on bass and vocals, Kevin Kingsley on guitars and saxophone, and Mason Shelby on synths and percussion. Their latest album reflecting the time and this cultural moment is called Everything is Normal. To feel better, go see them live. You can find out where they are playing on their Facebook and Instagram pages. If you have difficulty finding them, we share their events on I Hate Politics socials. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.